Thinking out loud. Hello, everyone. It's Shanna and Sophia here. Hope you missed us. Today, we're talking about biological psychology and how biology influences behavior and mental processes. Biological psychology focuses on how the brain, nervous system, hormones, and genetics affect the way we think, feel, and act. Instead of only looking at behavior from a social or emotional perspective, it allows us to perceive what's physically happening in the body.
A major focus is the brain. Different areas of the brain are responsible for things like memory, emotion, movement, and decision making. By studying these areas, psychologists can better understand why people behave the way they do.
Biological psychology is also important in understanding mental disorders. Conditions like depression, anxiety, schizophrenia are all linked to different structures in the brain chemistry and brain structure, not just life experiences.
Genes and their effect on psychology are very important. That's another key topic in biological psychology, because genes are inherited from our parents and influence both physical and psychological traits.
Genes can increase the risk of developing certain mental health disorders, but they do not guarantee that someone will develop them. Environmental factors such as stress, trauma, and upbringing also play a huge role.
This interaction between genes and the environment is often referred to as the nature versus nurture concept. Most psychologists agree that behavior is shaped by both.
Genes can also influence how the brain produces and regulates neurotransmitters. For example, genetic differences can affect serotonin levels, which are linked to mood and emotional regulation.
Neurons communicate using chemicals called neurotransmitters. These chemicals travel across a small gap between neurons called the synapse.
Neurotransmitters attach to receptors to the next neuron. Each receptor is designed to receive a specific neurotransmitters, which helps control how messages are sent through the brain. Drugs affect behavior by changing how neurotransmitters and receptors function. Some drugs increase or decrease the release of neurotransmitters, whilst others block or mimic them.
For example, antidepressants such as SSRIs increase the availability of serotonin in the brain. This can help improve mood and reduce symptoms of depression over time.
Other substances, including recreational drugs, can disrupt normal brain communication. Drugs that overstimulate dopamine pathways can increase the risk of addiction and long-term changes in brain function.
Even common substances like caffeine affect receptors. Caffeine blocks receptors involved in promoting sleepiness, which is why it increases alertness.
You may think, why is this relevant? Well, these mechanisms in the brain are what allow researchers to develop drugs that temporarily alter the brain's chemistry. This is accomplished when a drug changes neurotransmitter levels or receptor activity, which is super useful for creating treatments for mental health issues. A very clear example is the use of serotonin reuptake inhibitors, known as SSRIs, to treat anxiety by increasing serotonin levels. Anxiety could be managed effectively.
How is this possible? A lot of mental health issues like depression or PTSD mess with the chemical levels in the brain. Although it's important to emphasize that everyone's body is different and your chemicals levels don't always determine your mood. This is also referred to as bidirectional ambiguity.
If you don't know what that means, it's when there's a correlation between two variables, but there can be two possible explanations for why it happened. So you can't really pinpoint the cause. For example, a person with genetically lower baseline of serotonin might be more likely to develop depression, but it could also be to an external factor like childhood trauma that led to it. Moreover, since developing an illness like depression often impacts certain chemical levels, we can't know for sure if the depression is caused by decreased serotonin or if lower average serotonin caused the depression. That's why it's crucial to combine multiple therapies like mindfulness alongside SSRIs to make the recovery process truly effective.
Finally, PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder can be regulated with SSRIs like Zoloft or Paxil, which are actual names for some brands, because the PTSD causes the amygdala, which is a part of the brain that regulates the hormone adrenaline, becomes hyperactive and releases excess adrenaline, which then creates all the other subsequent symptoms like being constant tension due to the flight or fight mode.
Another very promising branch of biological psychology is brain neuroplasticity, aka the ability of the nervous system to change its structure, function, or connections in response to experiences. This can range from developing new neurons in specific regions to change in the strength or numbers of synapses. Neuroplasticity is the most active in your early years, when the brain is extremely sensitive to stimuli. For instance, when a baby is born, they have around 2,500 synapses. And in that 2 to 3 years, that jumps to 15,000. This explains why protecting kids from harmful experiences is so vital. What they witness or go through shapes their brain development, and they can absorb knowledge very quickly.
Another type of learning and memory plasticity. Another type of plasticity is the learning and memory one, where through practice you improve the number and strength of synapses. For example, when a memory shifts from short-term storage, which is mostly electrical and chemical signals, into long-term storage, which triggers structural or biochemical changes in the brain. Lastly, there's injury-induced plasticity, which occurs after there has been a damage to the brain, like a stroke or other reasons. Other brain areas reorganize to take over functions lost from the compromised parts.
This phenomenon is gaining tons of attention for a good reason. Experts are optimistic about how it can boost rehabilitation outcomes. And last but not least, let's mention the often overlooked gem of biological psychology, physiological psychology. Despite being a core area, it's one of the most least discussed areas, and it's very unappreciated. It studies the relationship between the brain and body and processes behavior, focusing on how neural, hormonal, and other physiological mechanisms shape us. Common topics include how specific brain regions drive behaviors like fear, sleep, learning, or even aggression. Thank you for listening to this episode of the podcast. See you next time.